really welcome everybody. I'm very happy that we see a lot of people attending this session. And for those people that don't know me, let me give you first a short introduction of who I am. My name is Richard Spithoven. I'm one of the managing partners of a company called B.lay, which is located in the Netherlands, and which is there to support end users in their efforts with managing software licenses in a proper way. And before I joined 2 years ago, I was heading up the license compliance team from Oracle's license management services team in the region Europe South for a total of 4 years. And before that, I was a LMS consultant, a licensing consultant from Oracle's license management team myself, performing audits on the mid-size and large customers in Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg. So the experience that I obtained during my years in LMS, I'm actually leveraging right now in my role within B.lay to support many different end users globally in their challenges with regards to enterprise software licenses in general. And then, of course, one of my specialties in there is Oracle licensing. Now, the agenda that we've created for you today is about a number of topics. If we're talking about the most common license compliance issues seen, it all starts with making sure that people do understand what their real license entitlements are and how all those different sources of documents that you would need to understand, read and maintain the knowledge around, how those documents all relate to each other. So that's where we're going to start the session with. Then we're going to talk a bit about the fact that there are no technical restrictions or license keys in the Oracle software. And then the majority of the session will be about what are now the real most compliance issues seen if you look at the different levels of an IT infrastructure, like the hardware, the software installation, the configuration of the software, the usage of the software, and any other non-technical issues that you can see from a license compliance perspective. So that's where we will focus on the majority of this session. And then we will conclude the session with some conclusions about how to handle it, what takeaways you can take with you, and obviously, as I said, we will leave some time for any questions that you may have. So to start with the presentation, I always believe it is very important for people to understand how actually your real license entitlements actually work, because the majority of the customers that I've been working with over the last years think, oh, I have here an Excel sheet that I got from Oracle support, or there is an Excel sheet that I created myself, and through that I keep track of all my licenses, so I exactly know what I can use from an Oracle database perspective. Reality is, however, typically different, and therefore a lot of customers underestimate where you need to look at from a license entitlement perspective. Now, in order to illustrate how it actually all works and is related to each other, I created this graphical overview here on the slide deck. Because the way it typically starts is that you buy the licenses through an order form, which is referring to a license agreement. And the order form lists the products, the quantities, and the metrics that you have obtained from an Oracle licensing perspective, but is then referring to the license agreement, in the past called Oracle Licenses and Services Agreement, before that SLSA, Software Licenses and Services Agreement, and nowadays called OMA, Oracle Master Agreement, which dictates the terms and conditions under which you are allowed to make use of the software that you have purchased through the order form. So the definitions like license metric definitions, but also the usage rights granted, are not listed in your order form, but are listed in your license agreement. Now, the way it works is that if you, for example, 6-7 years ago bought a license was available, then that means that you were allowed to make use of that specific release of the database. But since you have been paying support maintenance, at least that's what you typically see, support maintenance year over year over year over year, the moment that a new version of the Oracle database becomes available, like for example you now have 12c release 1, you do have the right to make use of the latest version. Now that typically is still clear with a lot of people. But what a lot of people tend to forget is that the Oracle Licenses and Services Agreement refers to a number of other sources of information where you need to look at to understand what you're actually really allowed to make use of. Because, for example, if you bought 6-7 years ago a database license, and at that moment in time version 11G release 1 was available, the program documentation of that specific version dictates a lot of specific terms that you need to take into account. Like, for example, what features and or components are part of that specific release, or what specific products do you need to license on top of the Oracle database that you may have purchased versus what is actually an included product in the license. Now, all that information is listed in the program documentation, and your OLSA or OMA specifies very explicitly that the program documentation is part of your license agreement as well. Now, in addition, the OLSA refers to a number of specific business practices or licensing documents. Like, for example, you may have in your processor license metric definition a reference to the Oracle Processor Core Factor table, or your application, Oracle applications that you have purchased from Oracle refer to the Oracle Application Licensing Table, which are all kind of documents that are listed online that you need to understand in order to understand what you're actually allowed to make use of your licenses. Now, to illustrate this, let us go through one example. So let's say your order form through which you purchase the licenses states that you bought 2 processor licenses, Oracle Database Enterprise Edition Perpetual, and 2 processor licenses, Tuning Pack Perpetual. Now, that order form will refer to a license agreement, like, for example, NL OLSA, and then the date of when the OLSA was released. And that license agreement defines the terms and conditions under which the usage rights have been obtained, and which terms and conditions you need to take into account once you start using the software. Like, for example, it will include the definition of a processor, where it says the processor is defined as all the processors where the Oracle programs are installed and or running. And it says, like I mentioned before, that if you need to determine the number of licenses, that you need to look at a so-called Oracle Processor Core Factor table, which is published online. So you see, one document refers to another document, and this document refers again to a document which is published online. Now, if you then move to that online document where the Oracle Processor Core Factor table is listed, that document will specify what specific core factors you need to take into account in order to determine the number of licenses. So, for example, if you go to that document, you will see that if you would have a server Sunfire T1000 with 2 CPUs and 8 cores per CPU, in which the speed is 1 gigahertz and it is an UltraSpark T1 processor, only in that situation Oracle would say, okay, you need to determine the number of processors by making this calculation. Would you have an HP ProLiant machine, then the core factor is different, because for an Intel Xeon machine it is 0.5, where for UltraSpark T1 it is 0.25, and you see the calculation is different. So that is the first thing that you need to take into account. One of the other things in there is that a lot of people don't know nowadays is that obviously Oracle is moving to the cloud and is providing cloud services. And a lot of people don't, for example, know that if you would deploy on-premise licenses in the Oracle Cloud, like, for example, you have on-premise licenses for SOA Suite for Oracle middleware, and you deploy that on the Oracle Java services, that Oracle would require you to apply this ratio in which 1 on-premise processor license equals 2 OCPUs, Oracle Compute Units, and 25 named user plus licenses on-premise would be 1 OCPU. Now, that information is not in your contract, it's not in your license agreement, it's not in your ordering document, but it is listed in the Processor Core Factor table that can be found online. And the moment that you've signed the agreement where a reference is being made to this URL, as a result of that, those terms and conditions are applicable for your licenses. Now, the other thing is that, like I said in the beginning, is that you've bought 2 processor licenses, Database Enterprise Edition and Tuning Pack, but you never buy 1 license from Oracle for just 1 specific functionality. Oracle licenses is always a suite of products and or components that are part of a specific license. For example, if you would want to make use of the Oracle Database Enterprise Edition, the program documentation, which can be found on docs.oracle.com, would specify what specific products and or components are part of that specific license. So if I would want to make use of G-Server Enterprise Edition, then that would be covered by Database Enterprise Edition license. Or, for example, if you talk about diagnostic pack, it lists a number of management connectors that are part of that specific license. Or it specifies specific licensing requirements, because your order form may say 2 processor licenses Oracle Database Enterprise Edition and 2 processor licenses Tuning Pack, but the fact that Tuning Pack usage requires at all times the licenses of Diagnostic Pack is being found in your program documentation, and it is not listed anywhere else. So the program documentation is really part of your license entitlements as well, and needs to be understood in order to understand what you're actually allowed to do with the software. Now, apart from the license rights and the OLSA and the program documentation, as I said, typically customers renew the support maintenance for their licenses. And what a lot of customers sometimes forget is that the support maintenance from Oracle gives you actually 2 different things. It gives you the right to call Oracle once you have an issue. So you receive technical support. You're allowed to log a service request, and then Oracle's support engineers will help you with addressing your issue. But you also have the right to make use of the latest version of the software. And the right to make use of the latest version or the latest release of the software is something that people should be taking into account. Why is that important? Well, apart from the fact that you need to make sure that you have a clear migration path internally from moving from an older database version to a later database version, a lot of customers are typically surprised when they have an old version running, and then the moment there is an issue, reach out to Oracle support, and then finding out that actually they're running an unsupported version. If you look, for example, at the table over here, you will see that a lot of customers are currently still running on 11.2, but the previous support of that version ended in January of this year. Now, does that then specifically mean that they have an issue straight away? No. It means that if they have an issue and Oracle is known and familiar with the issue, they will still help you. But if you encounter an issue in which Oracle is not aware of what the actual issue is, they will require you to enter into a so-called extended support contract, which is an additional investment of normally the first year 10% of your existing support maintenance fees in order to get the real support that you need for that older versions. So keeping track of at what dates specific versions are going out of support, as they say, is very important. Is that a real license compliance issue straight away? No, that's true. But you would be surprised how many customers have internal policies where they say that they at all times need to run on a current version from a security perspective, and then are at a later stage confronted with a multi-million-dollar bill because of the fact that they are required to have extended support, simply because of the fact they didn't look at the technical support policies, which defines at what moment in time a version is running out of support. Now, apart from the fact that the software updates license and support includes the technical support and the rights to make use of the latest version, the Oracle Technical Support Policies, or TSPs, define a number of terms that you need to take into account from a support maintenance perspective, like what is a license set, what is the matching service level policy, what repricing is applied if you want to reduce the number of licenses in your support contract, and what are the policies around the reinstatement of support of licenses. So those terms and conditions are part of your entitlements as well and should be taken into account. Now, next to that, like I said, there are different documents published online which are integral part of your license agreement. One of that is the Oracle Processor Core Factor Table. Another one is the Oracle Application Licensing Table, which defines what specific licensing rules and restrictions are applicable for the use of Oracle technology programs under an Oracle application, like the eBusiness Suite programs. And next to that, to make it even more complex, there are multiple different documents published online, like Oracle Server Partitioning Policy, determining what licensing rules are applicable in case virtualization technologies are being used, or Oracle's Disaster Recovery Licensing Policy, defining or explaining how the different disaster recovery scenarios should be licensed, which is all available, but where a lot of people are not aware of and we're not looking at. And typically what you see, people are not that are getting into a non-compliance situation is simply because of the fact that they do not have a clear understanding of all those different sources where they should look at in order to understand what they're actually allowed to do with the Oracle software. The last two policy documents that can be published online are the Oracle Data Transfer Policy and the Oracle Database Licensing Policy as a whole. Again, all published online business practice documents which provides explanation on how to license the specific environments. I'm not going to go into detail into all those documents during this session, but the general point that I want to make in here is that the amount of documents and sources of information that an end user needs to read, understand, and maintain should never be underestimated, because the devil is always in the details, and license compliance issues 9 out of 10 times are because of the fact that people are just not aware on how things actually are organized and how they relate to each other. 9 out of 10 times people just want to pay for what they're using, but are just not knowledgeable enough to understand what the real situation is. Now, why is it important to understand your license entitlements so well? Particularly because there are no technical restrictions or license keys in the Oracle software. Any Oracle software product can be downloaded from Oracle's Technology Network website without any restrictions. There are no technical keys in the software, and even if there are keys in the software because Oracle acquired certain software vendors, like for example Siebel still nowadays requires a license key to function, Oracle will publish the golden license keys freely on their license codes website. So any end user can make use of any Oracle software product at any time of the moment of the year by either just downloading the software or by downloading the key, which provides the opportunity to make use of any functionality of the software itself. And obviously, that causes a lot of compliance issues as well, because there is a lot more freedom and therefore a lot more responsibility at the end user, instead of technical restrictions or key preventing the usage of certain features in the software itself or having more users using the software. Now, to complicate matters, if you download software like the Oracle database software, it will come at all times with additional features and functionalities. So if you want to download, for example, the Oracle Database Enterprise Edition 12c Release 1, you will get a total of 17 different database options like partitioning, advanced compression, label security, spatial, data mining, etc., but also a number of database management packs like Diagnostic Pack, Tuning Pack, Database Lifecycle Management Pack, just downloaded with the Oracle database itself. So in that way, you will always download more functionality than that you're actually purchased licenses for. And therefore, you need to be aware of what you're actually allowed to use within the software, again, where there are no restrictions in the software, to make sure that you have the appropriate licenses in place to avoid as well that you're not using software where you don't have licenses for. So what are then the most common compliance issues, Richard? I hear a lot being asked, and actually one of the reasons why I'm organizing this webinar. Now, if I need to summarize it, there's approximately 20 different most common compliance issues that I see. First of all, on number in the top 5, I would say, is the fact that people are not aware of the fact that almost any Oracle product has a so-called license minimum. And a license minimum means that independent of the amount of actual users, there is always a minimum number of licenses where an Oracle database end user needs to comply with. You see in the table, for example, the most common one and the most common database version used is the Oracle Database Enterprise Edition. And you would be surprised how many people are still not aware of the fact that there is a minimum applicable which says 25 named user plus per processors needs to be applied. Now, what does that then mean in practice? If you look, for example, at this picture, and you would, for example, have a development environment where 2 different individuals are making use of the database, it is still not uncommon that people think, oh, I have 2 users, so I need to have 2 named user plus licenses. But since the Oracle Database Enterprise Edition is installed on a machine with 2 CPUs, and every CPU has 10 cores, Oracle would require you to have 25 named user plus per processor as a minimum number of licenses. Now, what you there see is that a lot of people think, oh, 2 CPUs, so 2 times 25, so 50 named user plus is my minimum. But people do forget that per processor is written down with a capital P, which means that Oracle refers to Oracle's processor definition. So if you follow Oracle's processor definition, in this example, it would be 2 times 10 is 20 cores multiplied by 0.5, because that is the core factor for Intel Xeon, resulting in 10 processors for according to Oracle's processor definition, resulting in the fact that this server would have a minimum of 10 multiplied by 25 is 250 named user plus licenses. Now, a lot of customers tend to forget that, and especially in test and development environments where many different databases are installed on many different servers, this counts easily up to a huge number of licenses that customers need to comply with, because they simply forget that you need to have a minimum number of licenses at all times. In addition to that, people should be aware of the fact that there are a lot of historical licensing metrics like named user, concurrent device, named user multi-server, and named user single server that all have their different licensing minimums. So licensing minimums are in almost all cases at all times applicable and have changed over time, but have always been there and therefore should be taken into account. Next to that is that people are counting processors in the incorrect way, because there are many different factors that can have an impact on how you need to count the number of processors, like the server model, the number of CPU, the number of cores per CPU, the CPU type, the purchase date of the hardware, and the configuration of the hardware itself. Meaning, is there any virtualization being applied? Is there any logical partitioning being applied? All those factors have an influence on counting the number of processors correctly. And if you look at, for example, the same example, you have two individuals making use of the database on a server, and the server has 10 CPU single-core Intel Xeon as their hardware specifications. I think 8 out of 10 customers would say, oh, it's Intel Xeon, so the processor factor is 0.5, not realizing themselves that the core processor factor table says for every single core machine you need to apply a factor of 1 instead of 0.5, and therefore making a difference of 50% of the number of licenses that they think they need to have for that environment, where in reality they need to have twice as much licenses. The next most common compliance issue, and I think the people that have been working with Oracle software are probably familiar with it, is VMware. Deploying Oracle software on VMware. Now, why is that an issue? It is an issue because a lot of customers are not familiar with the fact that Oracle does not recognize VMware as a technology to limit the number of licenses which are to limit the number of cores which are required to be licensed. Oracle therefore classifies VMware as a so-called soft partitioning technology, like it is published in its server partitioning policy. Long story short, Oracle has made a differentiation between the different types of virtualization technologies that are available, being soft partitioning and hard partitioning, and VMware is one of the most common virtualization technologies used with Oracle customers. Now, Oracle's reason from a compliance perspective to say to customers you need to license all the physical cores of all the physical machines on which the virtual machine with the Oracle software can be hosted is coming from the fact that the processor definition in the license agreement says you need to license the software once it is installed and or running. So when end users use a storage area network or another shared storage device, the installation of the software itself resides on the shared storage, and therefore all the VMware servers that point to the shared storage where the Oracle programs are installed need to be licensed. To make things even worse, if you look at VMware vSphere 5.1, which is one of the versions that are being used nowadays by almost any customer that uses VMware, you have the opportunity as an end user to move virtual machines between clusters or between data centers within one and the same vCenter server instance. So by having the knowledge on the fact that Oracle requires you to license the software once it is installed and or running, Oracle would require you to license in a VMware vSphere 5.1 or higher environment every single core of every single physical machine of every single cluster in every single data center of one and the same vCenter server instance. So what you see happening a lot is that a lot of customers create, for example, a specific cluster for Oracle where they have 3 hosts in there, and that is part of a specific data center. And another cluster is, for example, being created for Microsoft, and a third cluster is being created for IBM. Those customers all think they just need to license those 3 servers in this cluster, but not realizing themselves that the virtual machines that may initially be set up in this cluster can be moved within the whole vCenter server instance. And as such, all the physical servers of Prod Data Center 3, 2, and 1 are required to be licensed. Now, this is compliance issue number 1 that we see almost everywhere, where it's simply because of the fact that customers are not aware of the fact that this is the way Oracle looks at licensing its software in a VMware vSphere 5.1 or higher environment. The next topic is about Oracle VM, because a lot of customers that we've been working with over the last years then think, yeah, but okay, VMware, we do understand that there is an issue because Oracle requires us to license everything, but Oracle told us, yeah, we can make use of Oracle VM, and then we won't have the issue. That is partially true, because of course, from a sales perspective, it is rather easy to say to promote Oracle's virtual machine software, but Oracle VM is the similar way of licensing as VMware. Only Oracle recognizes it only as a hard partitioning technology in case you make sure that you are hard pinning specific cores to the specific Oracle software products. And there are different documents listed in the server partitioning policy that explains what limitations you need to comply with in order for Oracle to accept your Oracle VM configuration to be hard partitioning. Now, we see a lot that a lot of customers use Oracle VM, but are not familiar with the fact or not realizing themselves that they actually should hard code in Oracle VM dedicated cores to the Oracle software in order to avoid that they still need to license the whole physical server or the whole cluster, and therefore still having a compliance issue. The next topic that we see a lot is with regards to another virtualization technology, which is actually approved by Oracle as a so-called hard partitioning technology, which is IBM LPARs. Because IBM LPARs are technologies that are approved by Oracle to use them to limit the number of cores which are required to be licensed, but a lot of end users forget to cap their LPARs and just making LPARs on a machine, but not assigning a specific capped entitled capacity in terms of number of cores to the Oracle software, resulting in the fact that still the whole pool or the whole capacity of the server is required to be licensed. Now, I'm not going to go through all the details in there, but there are different ways of counting the number of licenses for LPARs with dedicated CPUs, the number for situations in which a physical shared processor pool is being organized, or if there are multiple shared processor pools created. And not knowing how to count the licenses in those IBM LPARs typically result in the fact that people think that they need to license just a small amount of cores, where in reality it turns out to be that there are much more cores that are required to be licensed. And to conclude the IBM LPAR, IBM came up with a new technology approximately 2-3 years ago, which is called live partition mobility. And live partition mobility is a technology which allows end users to migrate partitions from one physical server to another physical server. And a lot of customers forget that as a result of the fact that you can move LPARs from one machine to another machine, it requires, from an Oracle perspective, to license both the source and the destination server. And therefore, typically they think only the source needs to be licensed, but the destination server, in the end, has the Oracle software installed as well, and as such is required to be licensed. The next topic is about design recovery, and that is also something that continues to happen to cause a lot of issues for a lot of customers, because the basic principle of licensing Oracle software is misunderstood. As we've seen from the beginning, the Oracle software is required to be licensed once it is installed and or running. So the fact if you're using the software or not doesn't make any difference in the sense what you need to license it. Once it is installed, once the intellectual property from Oracle can be found on a disk array, or on a hard disk, like the binaries, the executables, and the DDLs, at that moment in time, you are required to license that installation. So what we see happening a lot is that a lot of customers think, yeah, but I'm not using my DR server, so don't need to license it. Well, that is not true. Again, installation determines the fact that you need to license the software. And on a high level, there are actually three different scenarios that Oracle sees from a DR perspective. You have standby and remote mirroring, in which in a standby environment, data is being synchronized on a database level by making use of technologies like DataGuard or Active DataGuard. And in that way, although the disaster recovery standby server may not be used or may not be often used, Oracle requires you to license both the primary production server and the secondary standby server. Why? The software is installed on both machines. And the license agreements say once the software is installed, it is required to be licensed. The whole reason behind that as well is that why you need to license both machines in the same way is that any transaction that is being performed on the primary production server is, through the use of DataGuard, for example, being transferred to the standby environment. And as such, the users of the standby environment are exactly the same users as the users of the primary production environment. So both environments needs to be licensed. The other situation from a disaster recovery perspective, which you see the last 4 or 5 years more often, is that there is no synchronization on database level, but on storage level, where you typically have two different locations in which there is one server connected to a storage on which the Oracle software is installed, which is being used for production. And in order to make sure that data is being synchronized to another location, especially financial services customers typically have a requirement to implement this, they mirror the data on storage level. Like, for example, EMC SRDF is a technology that is being used a lot. Now, in this way, again, the Oracle software is installed on both primary location A and the secondary location B, and requires you to license all the physical servers that are connected to the storage on which the Oracle software is installed on the primary production environment, but also the servers that are connected to the secondary disaster recovery location. Now then, the last scenario, which is typically misunderstood as well, is the failover scenario, because in failover scenarios, Oracle makes an exception, but a lot of customers have heard about that and say, oh, this is a failover environment, or this is a failover environment. But it actually doesn't classify as a failover environment. And why is that? Oracle made up a exception rule for specific, very specific disaster recovery solutions, where Oracle says only if you cluster two different servers and you point them to the same storage and you make sure that the primary production server is licensed and you do not make use of the secondary failover server for more than 10 days per calendar year, in which every event on a day counts as a day. Like, for example, if there is a failure of your primary production server today at 5 minutes to midnight, and the issue is resolved at 5 minutes past midnight, it counts as 2 days. So if you're not using this more than 10 times a year, and you are switching back once the failure is resolved on the primary production environment, only then, in that scenario, you do not need to license this specific server. In any other situation, like 3 servers clustered to the same SAN, you need to license the third server. In case you're making use of the failover server more than 10 days per calendar year, you need to license the secondary failover server. If you do not switch back once the failure is resolved, you need to license the secondary server. So those little granularity of detail with regards to the restrictions that Oracle has applied for failover scenarios are typically misunderstood, resulting in the fact that they are being found non-compliant during the course of an audit because they were not aware of what restrictions had to be taken into account in order to keep the failover server free of licensing. Customers not knowing where the software is installed. And again, like we've seen in the beginning, the Oracle software is required to be licensed once the software is installed. independent of the fact if the software is actually being used. So customers that actually don't know where the software is installed have issues. It's not uncommon that I've been engaging with customers where we asked them to fill in an Excel sheet in Oracle terminology, an Oracle Server worksheet, and we said, okay, list all your Oracle servers. And then uh, after we received that, we did a measurement on their network to see if what they delivered was complete and accurate. We did a test, and in 90% of the cases, end users forgot to declare certain Oracle servers in their Excel sheet. And then sometimes people said, yeah, but they did that on purpose because you were working for Oracle. No, it was not, because we asked them. It was a test. We didn't do any compliance claims as a result of that. We asked them, how did it come? And they just said, yeah, we didn't even realize that there was software installed on those servers because we're not managing them, or it is outsourced, or it is part of a specific application that we didn't have a clue of that there was an Oracle database installed on it. So not having a clear picture of where the software is installed causes 9 out of 10 times big issues as well. And that can either be because they don't know how to determine if the software is installed. For example, what executables, what running processes, or what specific procedures should you follow in order to find out if an Oracle database software is installed is typically lacking in an organization. Or they don't have any software inventory tooling in place, which means they can't even scan their server park. Or they have a software inventory tool, but they actually have never rolled it out completely on their whole IT infrastructure, and therefore always forget that there is another data center that they don't have any visibility on. Or, even worse, they think they are covered because they bought a software inventory tool, but actually the software inventory tool itself is not capable of identifying the specific Oracle database software to be installed in a complete and accurate manner. So they bought a tool, they think they're safe, but in reality the tool reports something different than the reality actually is.
If we're moving to the next part with regards to the most common compliance issues seen, then we're going to focus now on the software configuration. So if you're talking about software configuration, a lot of the issues that we see is related to the Oracle Database Edition. Because once you start downloading the Oracle Database software from Oracle's website, and you need to start the installation of the Oracle database, it's happening a lot that the default installation procedure is selected, which results in the fact that the Oracle Database Enterprise Edition is being installed, whereas if you would want to install the Oracle Database Standard Edition or Standard Edition 1 or the recently announced Standard Edition 2 Database Edition, you need to proactively select the right installation procedure in order to install such a Standard Edition database installation. So a lot of issues occur because of the fact people are just not selecting the right installation procedure, and as a result of the fact, by default always install the Oracle Database Enterprise Edition. Now, apart from that, what a lot of end users are not aware of is that the Oracle Database Editions have a certain amount of restrictions that need to be taken into account. So for example, for the Standard Edition 1 Oracle database, you need to be aware of the fact that it can only be installed on servers with a maximum capacity of 2 sockets. If you want to install the Oracle Database Standard Edition, it can only be installed on servers with a maximum capacity of 4 sockets. And for the Standard Edition 2, the restriction applies that you can only install it on a server with a maximum capacity of 2 sockets. So those restrictions should be kept into mind once you start installing such a database edition. And what we see happening a lot is that a lot of end users think, even if they have just only a big server with, let's say, 1660 CPUs dual core, they think, well, let us create a dedicated capped LPAR of 2 cores and 2 sockets, and then we will be able or eligible to install the Standard Edition 1 or the Standard Edition software on those LPARs. However, those end users do not realize themselves that the capacity of the whole server is 16 CPU dual core, and as such it's not allowed to install the Standard Edition 1, Standard Edition or Standard Edition 2 database on such a machine, even if it's an LPAR, and you are required to install the Oracle Database Enterprise Edition. Moving to the next slide, other issues that we see happening a lot is related to the database release. Because a lot of end users do not realize themselves that if they obtain an Oracle license, then they typically obtain as well software updates, license and support, or also called the support maintenance of the licenses. And within the support maintenance, you do not only have the right to have technical support, which means that if you have an issue with the Oracle database, you can log a service request and get support from the technicians from Oracle. That software updates license and support right also includes the right to make use of the latest version of the software. And therefore, end users that decide to not buy that support maintenance in relationship with their licenses, for example, because of the fact that they are moving to a third-party support supplier like Rimini Street, those end users typically don't realize themselves that they need to keep track of the latest versions, bug fixes and or patches that they're installing, because of the fact that they only have the right to make use of those patches, latest versions and bug fixes up to the date on which they have paid support maintenance. And therefore it's not uncommon that people that decide to cancel their support maintenance at a later stage start installing versions that they're actually not allowed to make use of, and therefore causing compliance issues, which has quite some financial consequences. The next part with regards to the software configuration compliance issues is related with regards to the Oracle Database Enterprise Edition options and database management packs. Because if you install the Oracle Database Enterprise Edition, depending on the version, but for 12c for example, a total amount of 17 different database options and database management packs are automatically installed with the Oracle Database Enterprise Edition itself. And that on itself is not a problem, but the usage of those features requires separate licensing. For example, if you start using partitioning or advanced compression, diagnostic pack, tuning pack, all the usage of those additional add-on features is required to be licensed separately. Now, because those database options and management packs are installed automatically with the Oracle database itself, we see a lot of database administrators that have the perception that they can already use the software because it's already installed. So they think, well, it's already installed, so why would I not be able to use it? And those database administrators are typically not aware or haven't checked what licenses are available, and therefore do not assure themselves upfront if you're actually allowed to make use of those options. So apart from that, it is also true that a lot of database administrators may make use of database options without even being aware of it. For example, what we see happening a lot is that a lot of database administrators make use of a feature called data pump, which is a feature of the Oracle database itself. But the moment that you start making use of data pump, you need to make sure that you're not using data pump compression, which is a feature that you can select once you do a data pump execution. And if you start triggering the data pump compression, it means that you need to license advanced compression, because data pump compression is part of the advanced compression database option and requires separate licensing. So that's what we see happening a lot. Customers being unaware of the fact that they use data pump compression while they're making a dump by making use of data pump, and therefore triggering a license requirement for the product advanced compression. Now, and to complicate matters, the difficulty that we see, which causes a lot of compliance issues as well, is that those database options and database management packs actually are also being used by the Oracle software itself, so-called system usage. And what we see is that a lot of the tools that customers use in order to manage their licenses report that system usage as usage, and therefore a lot of end users think that they need to license such a usage. For example, the Oracle Database Enterprise Edition has a schema where a user called SH is making use of partitioning. And a lot of people think, hey, that is usage of partitioning, so we need to license that. However, they're not realizing themselves that that system usage is not licensable, whereas if the usage would have been triggered by the end user itself, then that would be licensable usage and therefore required to be licensed. Now, the user SH is just only one example. We know that there are approximately 350 different exceptions for all kind of different options where standard schemas or standard functionality of the Oracle software itself triggers the usage of those options, while in reality that usage is already covered by the licenses that the customer obtained and is not separate licensable usage. So making that distinction between system usage and licensable usage is a very difficult point where a lot of end users are bumping into issues with. Now, we're moving to the software usage part. and the most common compliance issues seen around the usage of the software, then actually everything is circulated back to the named user plus definition. And if we have a closer look to the named user plus definition, you will see that there are a number of sentences where I highlighted a number of words in it in yellow. So let us have a closer look to that. If we look at the first sentence, named user plus is defined as an individual authorized by you to use the programs which are installed on a single server or on multiple servers, regardless of whether the individual is actively using the programs at any given time. So what does it actually mean? So it means if we start looking at the first part, individuals that are authorized to use the software is what you need to count. Now a lot of end users think, well, that probably are the employees of my organization, which typically is a large extent of the user population within an organization. But do think as well about, for example, agents, contractors, or individuals at your outsourcing company that are performing tasks on your behalf. Those individuals, those human beings, are authorized to make use of the software as well, and are therefore required to be licensed. So it's not FTEs, it's not about only looking at your employees, it's all about all the human beings, all the distinct human beings that are authorized to use the software. Now, going further in the sentence, you see you need to license the software that is installed on a single server or multiple servers. So what does that actually mean? Well, it means that me as an individual, if I'm licensed by one named user plus license, I do have the right to make use of the software on multiple servers. So even if I as a person have access to the Oracle Database Enterprise Edition on 10 different machines, it still is only one individual, being myself, which is authorized to make use of the software. And to complicate matters, if you're looking at how to determine the usage, you need to be therefore very clear about what usernames that you may find on an application level are actually related to one specific individual. So for example, if I have access to 3 different systems, and in one system my username is Richard S, in the second system my username is Spithoven R, and in the third system my username is defined as Spithof R, then although the usernames may be different, all those usernames relate back to one individual, being Richard, and therefore still only requires you to count one person. The last part of that sentence says, regardless of whether the individual is actively using the programs at any given time. So that means that if, for example, within an organization, 100 individuals have been authorized to make use of the software and have received a user account that is being set up in the system, but only 50 people of those 100 individuals are actively using the software, it still requires you to license 100 distinct individuals instead of 50, although even only 50 people are actively using the software. Now moving to the second part of the definition, it says a non-human operated device will be counted as a named user plus, in addition to all the individuals that are authorized to use the programs, if such devices can access the programs. So, but what is a non-human operated device, you may ask yourself? Well, a non-human operated device is, like it says, a device that is operated by and is having access by the software, but it's not operated by an individual. Because if a device would be operated by an individual, the individuals that are operating the device that is accessing the software would need to be licensed. A non-human operated device will therefore be all kinds of devices that are not operated by individuals and therefore, for example, can be sensors. Think, for example, about sensors that are measuring the temperature in a factory in the manufacturing process in order to make sure that they keep track of the temperature of a certain product that is being produced in a factory. Now that sensor will measure the temperature, and that data will be stored somewhere, for example, for quality assurance purposes. Those devices that are accessing the software are required to be licensed as well. Other example can be, for example, sensors in oil pipelines, where the sensors measure the pressure of the oil while the oil is being transported from location A to B. If those devices can access the software, those devices need to be counted on top of the individuals that have access to the software. If we're moving to the third part of the definition, it says if multiplexing hardware or software is being used, the number must be measured at the multiplexing front end. Now, many different end users have asked me over the last 10 years, but Richard, where is multiplexing defined in the contract? And it is true, it is not defined in the contract. The reason why it is not defined is because of the fact that the Oracle software can be part on so many different IT architecture situations that it is hardly impossible to define every single scenario on how the Oracle software could be part of a certain IT infrastructure. What is actually meant with it is that if there is an IT architecture, and for example, you do have 300 individuals that are having access to an application, and that application is making use of a middleware layer, and through the middleware layer they have two generic users that are accessing the database, then smart people would sometimes think, oh, well, there are just two generic usernames created on the database, so I have two users, so I only need to count two named user plus licenses. But the multiplexing front end of such a scenario would allow 300 individuals at application level to access indirectly the Oracle database, and therefore those 300 individuals receive value of the Oracle database and therefore are required to be licensed. So the easiest way to explain multiplexing is that you would at all times would need to go in the architecture and need to understand from a database level upwards in the IT architecture, where does the automated process stop and what specific individuals or devices are triggering data transactions in the Oracle database. And triggering data transactions should maybe even be specified a bit more, because every individual or non-human operated device that can create, read, update or delete directly or indirectly a data transaction in the Oracle database, those individuals at the end of the automated process, at the end of the multiplexing front end, or at the multiplexing front end, those are the ones that you should count in order to determine the required number of licenses. Then the last part of the definition talks about automated batching of data from computer to computer is permitted. Now, from an Oracle standpoint, automated batching means a one-to-one copy from a table from one relational database to a table from another relational database. And only if such a data transfer is taking place, in that case, Oracle would allow you to have such usage under the named user plus definition. Would you, however, have still old named user licenses, so not named user plus but named user, then the automated batching of data from computer to computer is not permitted. Now then, to conclude the most common compliance issues seen, there are some non-technical issues that we see happening quite a lot over the last period of time. First of all, a lot of end users are not aware of the fact that the software that is being obtained from Oracle is at all times restricted to a number of legal entities that are allowed to make use of the software. And those legal entities are defined typically in the so-called customer definition of your license agreement. And every single legal entity that is defined in that customer definition is allowed to make use of the software. By definition, it therefore also means that if a legal entity is not specified in the customer definition, then such legal entity is not allowed to make use of the software. Now, for very static organizations, that may not be a huge issue, but think about organizations that are very dynamic and are acquiring or divesting companies all the time. That means that the acquired entities need to be reviewed on a regular basis, and it needs to be clear if an acquired company is allowed to make use of the software, yes or no, and what terms and conditions are applicable in order to make sure that such an acquired entity is going to be allowed to make use of the software under the terms of your agreement. The last part is with regards to hosting, because what we see happening more and more as well is that a lot of end user organizations are providing IT hosting services to other third parties. And what a lot of end user organizations are not aware of is that if you want to do that, you need to have specific licenses for it. Why is that? Well, the typical license agreement specifies in the rights granted section of the Oracle Master Agreement or the Oracle License and Services Agreement that the software can only be used for your internal business operations only. And as such, if the software is being used to support the business operations of other third parties, that would require the end user to have separate hosting licenses to allow such usage. So to conclude the presentation, a lot of people ask me, "But Richard, how should we handle our database licenses then?" Well, actually the answer is rather simple. What I would always recommend end users to do is to make sure that you're proactive yourself and that you take the control yourself. And don't wait until you get audited by Oracle as a sitting duck thinking everything is fine without looking into it yourself. Being proactive will make sure that you will have a clear control and insight of what your situation is and what you would need to do in order to address any financial risks that you may face. But how do you do that then? Well, make sure that you perform regular internal license reviews or internal license audits in which you reconcile your entitlements and your deployments so that you can determine your license compliance position, and make sure that you make specific detailed plans on how to mitigate any financial, operational and legal risks that you may face. So some takeaways for the people here on this call today. My takeaway, the most important points that I would want to raise is that for every end user organization, make sure that your software license management activities are going to be prioritized at C-level, and make sure that you budget for the proper software license management practices that are tailored to the specific needs of your organization. And in order to give you a certain direction, for example, Gartner says that approximately 10% of the software maintenance that you're paying on a yearly basis to your enterprise software vendor should be budgeted in order to apply proper software license management. Once the necessity of doing proper license management is being known and supported on C-level, the next step would be is that you need to make sure that you create an internal team of multiple disciplines that are performing internal software license management activities. And in that team, you would want to have people from procurement, legal, database administrators, infrastructure managers, business application managers, and maybe if you've outsourced your IT, include your outsourcing company in there as well. And make sure that with the C-level sponsorship, you will get the time, the resources, and the budget to review on a regular basis what your real license entitlement position is, including all the documents that we talked about in the beginning, like the ordering documents, the license agreements, the support renewals, the support policies, the program documentation, and all the business practice documentation that is being published online by Oracle. Next to that, make sure that you really understand what the deployment and your licensable usage is of the Oracle software so that you have a clear view of what you're deploying, and reconcile those two on a regular basis to identify and address any software license compliance issues proactively instead of waiting until you are being inspected by Oracle. So this concludes the presentation of today. We have, as a company, a lot of documentation being published on our website, like for example, documents about the answers to your top 20 questions about Oracle license reviews or license audits. What about Oracle Unlimited License Agreements? What about Oracle Pool of Funds Agreements? And the detailed white paper about the Oracle database most common compliance issues seen. Apart from those, many different other white papers about other products and licensing rules and definitions and situations that we've seen over the last 10 years are published on our B.lay website as well. So if you have some time or you need to find something specific, please be invited to go to our website and look to see what kind of materials are already freely available for you, or if there are specific questions that you may have about certain topics, please feel free to drop us an email at any time at info@B.lay.com, and we're happy to support you with your challenges with regards to the management of your enterprise software licenses. This concludes the presentation of today. I hope everybody find it useful, and if there are any further questions, then I'm obviously very eager to help you with that. Or as said, if you have some questions at a later stage, please send them to us and we're happy to support you. Thank you so much.